Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we're talking about jealousy. Not the modern version, the quiet internal feeling you pretend you don't have while comparing yourself to strangers online. We're talking about medieval jealousy. The kind that was not an emotion, not a reaction, not even a personality flaw. It was a medical condition. A physical malfunction. A visible failure of the body to behave itself. In the Middle Ages, jealousy was not something you worked through. It was something happening to you internally, without your consent, like a leak. If you felt jealous, it meant your body fluids were misaligned, overheated, stagnant, or pooling somewhere they absolutely should not have been. You were not insecure. You were unbalanced. Medieval psychology did not ask why you felt jealous. It already knew the answer. Something inside you was wrong. Jealousy was most often linked to an excess of yellow bile, the hot, dry humor associated with anger, suspicion, competitiveness, and a general inability to mind one's own business. If you felt resentment towards someone more successful, more attractive, or more favored than you, medieval thinkers did not interpret that as a response to unfairness or loss. They interpreted it as internal combustion. Your liver, according to medieval medicine, was working overtime. It was producing too much bile. That bile was heating your blood. The heat was disturbing your thoughts. And the thoughts were turning against you. This was not metaphor. This was anatomy. Medieval scholars genuinely believed jealousy could physically warp the body from the inside out. A jealous person was described as tense, sharp-eyed, restless, unable to sleep, prone to suspicion, and incapable of trust. Which is, unfortunately, still accurate. The difference was that medieval psychology saw these traits not as emotional states but as symptoms. Jealousy made your blood thick. It made your pulse irregular. It dried the brain. It encouraged obsessive thought, which medieval psychology considered one of the most dangerous behaviors a person could engage in without a permit. Thinking too much about what others had, what you lacked, or what might be taken from you was considered a health risk. Rumination was not introspection. It was stagnation. Thoughts circling endlessly were believed to trap heat in the body, creating a feedback loop of suspicion and resentment. And medieval people were deeply afraid of feedback loops. A jealous mind did not rest. It watched. It measured. It compared. It imagined betrayals. Medieval psychology described jealousy as a form of internal surveillance. The jealous person was always alert, always scanning, always bracing for loss. This vigilance was not admired. It was diagnosed. Doctors believed jealousy weakened the heart. A person consumed by envy was thought to suffer from chest tightness, irregular breathing, and a sense of internal pressure. If you described emotional discomfort, they heard circulatory failure. If you described obsession, they heard bile buildup. There was no version of jealousy that medieval psychology considered useful or justified. Even when jealousy was socially understandable, it was still treated as pathological. A husband jealous of his wife's attention was not protecting his marriage. He was overheating. A rival envious of another's success was not ambitious. He was imbalanced. Women, of course, were believed to experience jealousy differently. According to medieval theory, women's bodies were colder and wetter, which meant jealousy did not burn in them. It fermented. Female jealousy was thought to be passive, brooding, internal, and especially dangerous because it lingered. While male jealousy flared hot and aggressive, female jealousy was believed to seep slowly into the body, poisoning thoughts over time. This conveniently explained why women were portrayed as scheming, manipulative, or emotionally unstable whenever they expressed dissatisfaction. If a woman was jealous, medieval psychology did not see pain. It saw moisture gone wrong. Jealousy in women was often linked to hysteria, uterine wandering, or emotional excess caused by improper fluid circulation. The solution was rarely reassurance. It was control. Supervision. Limitation. Women were not encouraged to resolve jealousy. They were encouraged to suppress it quietly before it caused further internal disruption. Marriage did not cure jealousy. It often intensified it. Medieval psychology viewed romantic jealousy as particularly dangerous because it combined bile, imagination, and desire, three things that were never supposed to interact unsupervised. Love already caused fever. Jealousy added suspicion. Together, they created what doctors described as a volatile temperament. A jealous lover was thought to suffer from loss of appetite, insomnia, obsessive thought, erratic behavior, and a tendency to interpret neutral events as personal threats. Again, medieval psychology accidentally described reality and then blamed fluids for it. If someone suspected infidelity, the issue was not trust. It was heat. Doctors might advise cooling foods, bland diets, reduced sexual activity, and avoidance of stimulation. Jealousy was treated by removing anything that made life interesting. Cold baths were a popular remedy. The idea was simple. You cannot be suspicious if you are shivering. Bloodletting was also common. If jealousy was caused by too much blood or bile, then removing some of it seemed logical. This logic applied universally and without mercy. Medieval treatments for jealousy did not ask whether the jealousy was justified. Whether betrayal had occurred was irrelevant, what mattered was restoring balance. Truth was secondary to temperature. In extreme cases, jealousy was believed to lead directly to madness. A jealous person who obsessed too deeply could dry out the brain completely, resulting in paranoia, delusions, or violence. Medieval psychology did not see these outcomes as tragedies. They were confirmations. If a jealous person became erratic, it meant the diagnosis had been correct all along. Jealousy was also morally suspicious. Envy was one of the 7 deadly sins, which meant it was both a medical condition and a spiritual failure. This was extremely efficient. You could be punished and treated simultaneously. Religious authorities warned that jealousy corroded the soul. Medical authorities warned it corroded the body. Either way, the solution involved discipline, deprivation, and obedience. Jealousy toward social superiors was especially condemned. A peasant envying a noble was not reacting to inequality. He was overstepping his natural balance. His bile did not know its place. Medieval psychology functioned beautifully as a defense of hierarchy. If you envied someone wealthier, more powerful, or more respected, the problem was not the system. It was your organs. Children were not exempt. A jealous child was not learning social boundaries. They were displaying early signs of imbalance. Parents were encouraged to discourage envy immediately, often through shame or punishment, to prevent it from hardening into a permanent temperament. Jealousy was not something you outgrew. It was something you managed or suffered from indefinitely. Monks wrote extensively about jealousy, usually in others. Envy within monasteries was seen as particularly dangerous because it disrupted spiritual harmony. If one monk resented another's piety, intelligence, or favor, it was treated as both sin and sickness. Confession was required. So was fasting. Occasionally, isolation. The jealous mind was seen as noisy, distracted, unsettled. Medieval psychology valued stillness above all else. Any emotion that disrupted internal quiet was suspect. And jealousy was never quiet. It whispered comparisons. It replayed conversations. It imagined futures. It anticipated losses that had not occurred. Medieval thinkers looked at this mental activity and concluded something must be leaking. The idea that jealousy might be a response to fear, attachment, or insecurity was never seriously considered. That would have required acknowledging internal experience. Medieval psychology preferred surfaces, substances, and simple explanations. So jealousy became bile. Something measurable, removable, and blameworthy. And because jealousy never fully went away, medieval psychology never stopped treating it. People lived their entire lives adjusting diets, suppressing thoughts, avoiding stimulation, and monitoring themselves for signs of envy. The goal was not happiness. It was equilibrium. A person free of jealousy was not joyful. They were properly contained. Modern psychology sees jealousy as a complex emotional response tied to attachment, self-worth, and social comparison. Medieval psychology saw it as a hot fluid misbehaving inside you. And honestly, given how uncomfortable jealousy feels, many medieval people probably found that explanation reassuring. Medieval people were deeply invested in the idea that emotions should leave as little evidence as possible. Feelings were tolerated only if they passed through quickly, like weather. Jealousy did not pass quickly. It lingered. It nested. It returned at inconvenient moments. That alone made it suspicious. A jealous person was believed to be internally cluttered. Medieval psychology prized emptiness. A clear body produced clear thoughts. A clear mind reflected divine order. Jealousy disrupted that order by introducing comparison, which was considered an unnecessary cognitive luxury. Comparison required imagination. Imagination was dangerous. The medieval imagination was not seen as creative or expressive. It was a semi-physical faculty that could influence the body directly. Imagining betrayal, loss, or humiliation could allegedly heat the blood, disturb digestion, and weaken the heart. Jealousy relied heavily on imagination, which made it doubly threatening. A jealous person was often described as visually overactive. Medieval texts frequently mention sharp eyes, darting glances, and restless observation. Watching too closely was not curiosity. It was pathology. A calm person did not monitor others for signs of advantage or affection. They accepted their position and remained internally still. This is why jealousy was often framed as a failure of acceptance rather than a response to deprivation. If you envied someone, it meant you were resisting the natural order. Your body reflected that resistance through discomfort. Medieval psychology did not distinguish clearly between jealousy and envy. Both involved wanting what someone else had, fearing its loss, or resenting its existence. The nuance was unimportant. The sensation was the same: internal agitation. Doctors warned that prolonged jealousy could dry the body. Moisture was life. Dryness was decay. A jealous person was thought to age faster, wrinkle sooner, and lose vitality prematurely. Envy was not just unattractive morally. It was physically dehydrating. This belief made jealousy especially frightening in older age. An elderly person showing signs of jealousy was thought to be accelerating their own decline. Instead of resting into acceptance, they were stirring internal heat that the body could no longer manage. Young people were expected to feel jealous. Older people were expected to have outgrown it. When they didn't, it was seen as proof of poor moral hygiene. Jealousy also had a social smell. Medieval writers frequently described it as foul, sour, or bitter. Emotional states were believed to produce odors through sweat and breath. A jealous person might literally smell wrong. This was not poetic language. It was physiology. This meant jealousy could expose itself even when unspoken. You could hide your resentment, but your body would betray you. This belief encouraged constant self-surveillance. If you felt envy, you were supposed to suppress it immediately, before it fermented. Fermentation was a popular metaphor for emotions that lingered too long. Just as food spoiled when left unattended, feelings spoiled when dwelled upon. Jealousy was considered especially prone to rot. The jealous mind replayed scenes repeatedly. Medieval psychology saw repetition as stagnation. Healthy thought moved forward. Repetitive thinking was circular, and circular motion was associated with illness. This is why medieval advice often included distraction, prayer, physical labor, or sleep. Not as coping mechanisms, but as methods of redirecting internal flow. Movement prevented buildup. Stillness allowed pressure. Ironically, the jealous person was often sleepless, restless, and over-alert, which only confirmed the diagnosis. Insomnia was a classic symptom of imbalance. If you could not sleep, your thoughts were too warm. Dreams were also suspect. Jealous dreams were believed to reveal the body's hidden state. Dreaming of rivals, loss, or humiliation was seen as evidence that envy had penetrated deeply. Dreams were diagnostic tools that if jealousy persisted long enough, it could supposedly alter personality. A once gentle person might become irritable, suspicious, or withdrawn. Medieval psychology did not interpret this as emotional growth or trauma. It was physical degeneration. Jealousy did not teach lessons. It damaged systems. Some texts warned that jealousy could even affect fertility. In men, excessive heat was thought to weaken semen. In women, emotional disturbance could disrupt reproductive balance. This allowed jealousy to be blamed for childlessness, conveniently removing responsibility from circumstance or chance. A jealous marriage was not unhappy because of conflict. It was unhealthy because of mismanaged fluids. Medieval law occasionally intersected with these beliefs. A person accused of crimes motivated by jealousy might be seen as partially compromised, but rarely excused. Imbalance explained behavior but did not absolve it. You were still responsible for managing your body properly. This expectation applied unevenly. Powerful men were often indulged. Their jealousy was framed as passion or rightful concern. Those with less status were more likely to be diagnosed rather than justified. Again, medieval psychology functioned smoothly alongside hierarchy. Jealousy toward God was also discussed, briefly and carefully. Wanting divine favor was acceptable. Resenting others for receiving it was dangerous. Saints warned against spiritual jealousy, which could undermine humility. Even holiness was competitive, and envy was the contamination that made it visible. In monasteries, jealousy was feared because it disrupted silence. Not physical silence, but internal quiet. A monk resentful of another's devotion was mentally noisy. That noise threatened collective harmony. Silence was medicine. The ultimate goal of medieval emotional regulation was not expression. It was containment. Feelings were tolerated if they remained proportionate, brief, and invisible. Jealousy violated all three conditions. It was excessive, persistent, and difficult to hide. So medieval people lived with it carefully. They avoided triggers. They monitored reactions. They blamed their organs. They prayed. They fasted. They cooled themselves physically and morally, and still, jealousy persisted. Because no matter how carefully you manage bile, comparison is hard to extinguish in a world built on visible inequality. Medieval society was intensely stratified. Status was everywhere. Clothing, speech, diet, posture. You were constantly reminded of what others had that you did not. Jealousy was inevitable, which made it even more threatening. An emotion that everyone feels but no one should have is an administrative problem. So medieval psychology framed jealousy as an error, not a response. Something gone wrong, not something learned. This allowed the system to remain unquestioned. If envy hurt, it was because you were flawed. Not because the world was. And that idea, quietly, survived far longer than medieval medicine. Jealousy also had a calendar. Medieval people believed certain seasons made it worse. Summer, with its heat and abundance, was thought to inflame envy. When crops grew unevenly, when trade moved, when marriages were announced, jealousy found opportunities. Winter, by contrast, was quieter. Cold constrained emotion. Hunger simplified priorities. There was less to compare. This led to the belief that jealousy could be anticipated. If you knew the season, the temperament, the diet, and the social position of a person, you could predict their envy. Medieval psychology loved predictability. It made people manageable. Astrology joined in. Certain planetary alignments were said to encourage jealousy, particularly influences associated with Mars and Saturn. Mars brought aggression. Saturn brought brooding. Together, they created suspicion that lingered without resolution. If you were born under the wrong configuration, jealousy was not a flaw. It was a feature. This was comforting in a way. You were not uniquely petty. You were cosmically inconvenienced. Astrological jealousy did not excuse behavior, but it explained why some people were more prone to it. A person who struggled with envy throughout life might be advised to accept it as part of their nature and manage it carefully, like a chronic condition. Jealousy was not cured. It was contained. Containment often meant narrowing one's world. Medieval advice frequently suggested reducing exposure to comparison. Avoid feasts where wealth was displayed. Avoid gatherings where favor was uneven. Avoid situations where attention was limited and competition unavoidable. This was not framed as avoidance. It was framed as prudence. If jealousy was triggered by visibility, then limiting what you saw was a form of treatment. The fewer contrasts you witnessed, the calmer your internal state would remain. This encouraged social separation along class lines, which again worked very well for the system. Jealousy between siblings was also a concern. Medieval families were hierarchical. Birth order mattered. Favor was uneven. Inheritance was competitive. Envy among siblings was common and treated as an early training ground for emotional discipline. A jealous child was not comforted. They were instructed. They were taught to accept their place. Acceptance was the antidote to envy. This lesson followed people into adulthood. If you envied someone, you had failed to internalize acceptance. Your jealousy revealed immaturity, not injustice. Medieval stories reinforced this idea constantly. Tales warned of envious figures whose resentment led to ruin. The jealous courtier. The resentful brother. The suspicious lover. Jealousy was always punished, not because it was harmful to others, but because it destabilized the self. The jealous person lost control. Lost balance. Lost favor. This made jealousy self-confirming. If you envied someone, the stories promised you would fall further behind. And if you didn't, it was because you learned to suppress it. Suppression was not seen as unhealthy. It was seen as refinement. That a refined person did not display envy. They did not speak of unfairness. They did not dwell on what others had. They maintained internal neutrality. This neutrality was admired. Neutrality was peace. Of course, neutrality was easier for those already comfortable. Medieval psychology did not address that. Jealousy toward friends was considered especially shameful. Envy directed upward could be rationalized. Envy directed sideways was uglier. If you resented a peer, it meant you were too focused on comparison rather than improvement. Improvement, however, was narrowly defined. You could improve your virtue. Your obedience. Your restraint. You could not reasonably expect to improve your status. Jealousy thus became a quiet companion to ambition. Ambition was acceptable if it was patient and humble. Jealousy was what happened when patience ran out. The jealous person wanted change now. Impatience was another sign of heat. Medieval doctors sometimes described jealousy as a fever without temperature. The body felt warm internally, even if the skin was cool. This invisible heat made it especially dangerous. You could look calm while burning. This fear of hidden states permeated medieval thought. What you felt inside mattered less than what it did to your balance. Internal disturbance was unacceptable even when invisible. This is why confession mattered. Speaking envy aloud was a way to release pressure. Silence could trap it. But confession was structured. Controlled. Guided. You did not explore your feelings. You admitted them briefly and submitted to correction. Correction restored order. Jealousy that went unconfessed was believed to fester. It could harden into resentment, then malice, then sin. Medieval psychology imagined emotions as moving along predictable tracks. Jealousy was an early warning sign. If caught early, it could be managed. If ignored, it escalated. This escalation model made jealousy feel urgent. You were supposed to notice it quickly and act. Delay was dangerous. Sitting with envy was not reflective. It was negligent. Modern advice often encourages sitting with feelings. Medieval advice encouraged moving them along immediately. Movement mattered. Physical activity was recommended not for fitness but for circulation. A jealous person was advised to walk, work, lift, or labor until the heat dispersed. Idleness was a risk factor. This belief tied morality to productivity. A busy person was less likely to envy. A lazy person had time to compare. Jealousy thus became associated with sloth, another deadly sin. The categories blended easily. Jealousy was rarely treated with kindness. It was treated with discipline. Cooling foods. Plain clothing. Reduced indulgence. Emotional restraint. Comfort was not part of the prescription. And yet, despite all of this effort, medieval people never eliminated jealousy. They managed it, named it, blamed it, punished it, and ritualized it, but it remained. Because jealousy is not a medieval invention. Only the explanation was. The feeling itself was ancient, persistent, and stubbornly human. And medieval psychology, for all its confidence, never quite solved what to do with a feeling that arose naturally in a world designed to provoke it. So it labeled it a malfunction. And asked people to live accordingly. Jealousy also had a posture. Medieval writers described the jealous body as tense, forward-leaning, alert in a way that suggested readiness rather than rest. A relaxed body was balanced. A tight body was guarding something. That guarding was suspicious. Suspicion itself was considered corrosive. To suspect too much was to mistrust divine order. Medieval psychology believed that trust was not merely social. It was physiological. A trusting person was internally open. A jealous person closed inward, tightening vessels, slowing flow, trapping heat. This inward turning was feared. Anything that turned inward too much risked becoming self-consuming. Jealousy was said to narrow perception. A jealous person fixated on one comparison, one rival, one imagined threat. This narrowing was considered dangerous because it reduced awareness of the whole. Balance required breadth. Jealousy reduced the world to a single point of tension. Doctors worried about this fixation. Prolonged focus on one person or situation was believed to carve grooves in the mind. Once carved, thoughts would return to them automatically. Habitual jealousy became temperament. Temperament was destiny. Medieval psychology divided people into types based on humors. A choleric temperament, hot and dry, was especially prone to jealousy. Such people were ambitious, competitive, sharp-tongued, and easily provoked. They were useful in conflict and difficult in peace. A melancholic temperament could also experience jealousy, but differently. Instead of flaring outward, envy turned inward, becoming quiet resentment, sadness, or withdrawal. This was considered more insidious because it was less visible. Visible jealousy could be corrected. Hidden jealousy could grow. This distinction mattered socially. Loud jealousy was disruptive. Silent jealousy was unsettling. Medieval society preferred disruption it could see. Jealousy among rulers was particularly dangerous. Chronicles often described kings whose envy led to paranoia, purges, and isolation. These accounts framed jealousy as a warning sign of declining authority. A ruler who envied subordinates had already lost internal balance. But again, the explanation was physical. Too much bile. Too much heat. Poor digestion. The idea that power itself might produce insecurity was not explored. Jealousy toward success was also medicalized. If you resented another's prosperity, the assumption was that your internal state was disturbed. Prosperity itself was not questioned. The reaction to it was. This pattern repeated endlessly. Feelings were problems. Structures were natural. Jealousy toward beauty followed similar logic. Attraction mixed with resentment was considered especially volatile. Wanting what you admired but could not possess created tension that medieval psychology struggled to classify cleanly. So it defaulted to heat again. Heat explained desire. Heat explained anger. Heat explained envy. Heat was the universal culprit. Cooling became the universal solution. Cold water, cold foods, cold environments. Emotional cooling through prayer and restraint. Cooling language. Cooling habits. The goal was always the same. Reduce intensity. Intensity was dangerous. Medieval psychology did not trust strong emotions of any kind. Jealousy was just one example. Love was fever. Anger was combustion. Fear was circulatory failure. Happiness was suspicious. Calmness was ideal. Calmness meant compliance. This made jealousy particularly problematic because it implied dissatisfaction. A jealous person wanted change. Medieval society was not designed to accommodate that. So jealousy had to be framed as error. There were rare moments when jealousy was almost justified. Religious texts sometimes acknowledged righteous envy, the desire to emulate virtue. But even then, the language was careful. You could admire and aspire. You could not resent. Resentment was the poison. Medieval advice often encouraged gratitude as a counterweight. Gratitude was not emotional appreciation. It was cognitive discipline. Listing what you had, accepting it as sufficient, and refusing to dwell on absence was dangerous. A person who focused on what they lacked was inviting imbalance. This applied not just to material things, but to affection, recognition, and opportunity. Wanting attention was risky. Wanting fairness was riskier. Jealousy of affection was particularly fraught. Love was supposed to be ordered. Affection distributed unevenly caused instability. If you noticed that instability and reacted emotionally, the reaction was treated as the problem, the solution was often moralizing. Be content. Be humble. Be patient. These were not emotional skills. They were survival strategies. Medieval psychology treated jealousy the way it treated most emotions, as something to be endured quietly until it passed or you did. The absence of empathy in this approach is striking, but consistent. Understanding feelings was not the goal. Controlling outcomes was. If jealousy led to conflict, violence, or disruption, then preventing jealousy was preventative medicine. It didn't matter how. So society structured itself to discourage open comparison, even as it displayed hierarchy constantly. This contradiction produced tension, which was then blamed on individual bodies. Jealousy thus became a personal failing in a comparative world. And because it was personal, it was isolating. You were not encouraged to share envy. Speaking it aloud risked shame. Confessing it risked punishment. So jealousy was often experienced alone, quietly, internally. Which made it stronger. Medieval psychology unintentionally created the conditions for the very emotional buildup it feared. By discouraging expression and reflection, it forced feelings inward. By framing emotions as dangerous, it encouraged vigilance. By blaming bodies, it discouraged questioning. Jealousy survived all of this because it adapted. It became quieter. More controlled. More hidden. And that, in medieval terms, was progress. There was also the idea that jealousy could be inherited. Not taught, not learned, but passed quietly through bloodlines. Medieval thinkers believed certain families carried emotional tendencies the way they carried physical traits. If a lineage was known for rivalry, suspicion, or internal conflict, jealousy was assumed to be part of its nature. This belief discouraged sympathy. If jealousy ran in families, then struggling with it was not a misfortune. It was expected. You were simply fulfilling a pattern. Patterns mattered more than individuals. Jealousy was also tied to memory. Medieval psychology believed that the mind replayed images repeatedly, and that these images shaped emotion. A jealous person was thought to replay moments of comparison over and over, reinforcing the imbalance. Memory was not passive. It was active, almost muscular. This is why distraction was recommended. Not reflection. Distraction. Keeping the mind occupied prevented it from returning to the image that caused envy. The jealous thought was not examined. It was replaced. The goal was interruption, not understanding. Understanding was risky. Too much analysis could deepen fixation. Medieval thinkers feared introspection. Looking inward too closely might reveal chaos. Better to maintain order on the surface and trust that balance would follow. Jealousy threatened this surface order because it was difficult to see and impossible to fully control. You could regulate behavior. You could regulate speech. But thoughts were slippery. So medieval psychology focused on shaping environments rather than minds. Structured routines. Fixed roles. Predictable hierarchies. Ritualized days. If life was repetitive enough, there would be less room for comparison. This is one reason ritual mattered so much. Ritual reduced choice. Reduced choice reduced envy. If everyone followed the same rhythms, personal longing had fewer places to attach. Jealousy thrived in moments of deviation. When someone rose unexpectedly. When attention shifted. When outcomes surprised. Predictability was emotional safety, even celebrations were carefully controlled. Excessive celebration could provoke envy. Too much display risked stirring resentment. This applied especially to wealth and marriage. Marriage ceremonies emphasized order rather than romance. Romance was unstable. Order was reassuring, jealousy between spouses was addressed sternly. Suspicion within marriage threatened lineage, inheritance, and social stability. A jealous spouse was advised to trust, endure, and restrain. Questioning was framed as weakness, trust was mandatory that if trust failed, the failure was blamed on temperament. Again, the body. The jealous spouse was often portrayed as foolish, even when suspicion was justified. Medieval narratives rarely rewarded jealousy with truth. The jealous character was wrong by default. This taught an important lesson: even if you are correct, expressing jealousy is still a fault. Being right did not redeem the emotion. Jealousy among neighbors was another concern. Small communities amplified comparison. Who had better crops? Who received more favor? Who was invited? Who was overlooked? These micro-comparisons were constant. Medieval advice urged people to keep their attention narrow. Tend your own field. Mind your own household. Looking sideways invited trouble. Looking upward was safer than looking sideways. Envy of the powerful could be absorbed into resignation. Envy of peers was destabilizing. It threatened cohesion. This made jealousy a social risk as well as a personal one. A jealous person disrupted harmony simply by noticing imbalance. So medieval psychology encouraged blindness as virtue. Not literal blindness, but selective attention. See what concerns you. Ignore the rest. Peace depended on ignorance. This idea extended to knowledge itself. Learning too much about others' lives could provoke envy. Curiosity was not always encouraged. Sometimes ignorance was safer. Jealousy was framed as the cost of awareness. The more you knew, the more you compared. The more you compared, the more you suffered. Therefore, limit knowledge. This applied even to religious devotion. Comparing piety was dangerous. Feeling spiritually inferior could provoke envy. So devotion was meant to be private, measured, modest. Anything excessive risked comparison. Excess was always the enemy. Despite all this caution, jealousy never disappeared. It simply shifted shape. It became quieter, more internal, more disciplined. That a medieval person might not shout or accuse or confront. They might simply withdraw. Become colder. Become more rigid. Become less generous. These changes were rarely linked back to jealousy explicitly. They were attributed to temperament, aging, or divine testing. The emotion dissolved into character. And once jealousy became character, it was no longer something to fix. It was something to endure. Medieval psychology accepted endurance as success. If you lived with envy and did not act on it, you were virtuous. It did not matter how much it hurt. Pain without disruption was acceptable. This is perhaps the clearest difference between medieval and modern approaches to emotion. Medieval thought did not prioritize well-being. It prioritized stability. Jealousy threatened stability because it implied movement. Desire for change. Dissatisfaction with order. So it had to be neutralized, cooled, contained, and eventually absorbed. And when that failed, it was punished. Not always outwardly. Often inwardly. A jealous person learned to blame themselves. To distrust their perceptions. To doubt their feelings. To assume imbalance was internal, not external. This made jealousy deeply lonely. No one was meant to help you with it. You were meant to master it alone. Which many never did, and medieval psychology accepted that too. Because a world that demands stillness cannot offer relief to feelings that want motion, over time, jealousy stopped being described as an event and started being described as a condition. Something ongoing. Something ambient. A background disturbance rather than a crisis. Medieval psychology was comfortable with long-term discomfort. It assumed life was meant to be endured, not optimized. If envy lingered for years, that was unfortunate, but not unusual. This acceptance shaped how people interpreted their inner lives. A person might recognize jealousy the way they recognized chronic pain. It was there. It flared. It subsided. It did not require resolution. It required tolerance. Tolerance was praised. There was also the belief that jealousy could sharpen perception in limited ways. A jealous person noticed details others ignored. Changes in tone. Shifts in favor. Subtle exclusions. Medieval writers acknowledged this awareness but treated it cautiously. Perception without authority was dangerous. Seeing injustice did not grant permission to challenge it. So heightened awareness became another burden. You noticed more, but you were allowed to do less. This awareness fed into suspicion, which medieval psychology distrusted deeply. Suspicion implied doubt, and doubt implied lack of faith. Faith was not only religious. It was social. You were expected to believe in the fairness of your role. Jealousy cracked that belief. Because jealousy whispered that the distribution was not fair. That someone else had more than they deserved. That you had less than you should. These thoughts were destabilizing. So they were framed as distortions rather than insights. A jealous mind was considered unreliable. This unreliability justified dismissing complaints. If someone spoke from envy, their words could be ignored. Jealousy discredited testimony. This made jealousy politically useful. Labeling dissent as envy neutralized it. Complaints became personal weakness rather than structural critique. Medieval psychology did not invent this tactic, but it refined it. Even saints were not immune to jealousy, according to some accounts. Religious texts acknowledged envy among monks and clerics, especially in enclosed communities where comparison was unavoidable. Who prayed better? Who was favored? Who advanced? The solution was not openness. It was stricter discipline. Silence. Isolation. Increased labor. Reduced interaction. If jealousy emerged, the response was subtraction. Less comfort. Less connection. Less individuality. Jealousy was treated like excess growth that needed trimming. The idea that connection might relieve envy was not seriously considered. Connection created comparison. Comparison created jealousy. Distance was safer. This logic applied to friendship as well. Deep friendships risked envy if affection felt uneven. So friendships were often kept measured, functional, restrained. Too much closeness created emotional risk. This restraint shaped emotional expression broadly. Medieval people were not emotionless, but they were trained to limit display. Jealousy, being socially embarrassing, was especially hidden. Hidden emotions did not disappear. They adapted. Jealousy became indirect. Passive. Expressed through withdrawal, coldness, moral judgment. Rather than saying, "I want what you have," a jealous person might criticize how it was obtained. Moral framing was safer than emotional honesty. This tendency can be seen in medieval sermons and moral tales, where envy is often masked as righteousness. The jealous figure claims moral superiority while resenting advantage. This was recognized, but not forgiven. Jealousy dressed as virtue was still jealousy. The problem was that medieval psychology offered no alternative language. You could not say, "I feel left behind," or "I feel overlooked," without implying dissatisfaction with order. So jealousy had to disguise itself or remain silent. Silence, however, did not equal peace. Internally, jealousy was believed to erode joy. A jealous person could not fully enjoy their own successes because they were always measuring them against others. Medieval writers noted this with a tone of grim inevitability. Envy spoiled pleasure. This was sometimes used as deterrence. Why envy, they asked, when it only multiplies suffering? But this argument assumed jealousy was chosen. Medieval psychology rarely treated jealousy as involuntary. Responsibility was emphasized. You were responsible for your internal balance. If envy arose, it was because you failed to regulate. Failure was personal. This personal framing isolated people further. You did not seek help for jealousy. You corrected yourself. Or tried. If correction failed, you endured quietly. There were moments of compassion, but they were rare and limited. Compassion risked validating the feeling. Validation risked legitimizing dissatisfaction. Legitimizing dissatisfaction threatened stability. So medieval psychology remained firm. Jealousy was a disturbance. A weakness. A heat. A narrowing. A threat to order. Even when it understood the mechanics, it refused to soften the judgment. Understanding did not equal forgiveness. This rigidity had consequences. People learned to mistrust their own emotions. To doubt their interpretations. To assume discomfort meant personal failure. This mindset produced obedience, but not peace. Jealousy lingered under the surface of daily life. In glances. In silences. In small resentments that never found voice. And because it had no outlet, it accumulated. Medieval society was stable, but tense. Jealousy did not explode often. It simmered. Occasionally it erupted in conflict, accusation, or violence, and when it did, it was treated as proof that the person had failed to contain themselves. Containment was the ultimate virtue. If you could carry envy without letting it spill, you were successful, regardless of the internal cost. This is why medieval psychology appears calm on the surface. Its goal was not happiness. It was containment. Jealousy tested that goal constantly. And the solution was always the same. Endurance shaped how time was experienced. Jealousy was not something you processed quickly. It stretched. It lingered. It became part of the background of a life measured more by obligation than fulfillment. Medieval psychology assumed long durations of emotional discomfort were normal, even healthy, because they reinforced humility. If you carried envy for years, it meant you were being tested. Testing was everywhere. Jealousy was framed as one of many trials designed to refine the soul. Not to remove desire, but to exhaust it. The goal was not balance in the modern sense. The goal was surrender. This reframing changed how people related to their own aspirations. Wanting more was dangerous. Wanting what someone else had was worse. Aspiration easily slid into envy, and envy slid into moral failure. So ambition learned to disguise itself. People learned to want quietly. To downplay hopes. To present acceptance even when they felt dissatisfaction. Medieval psychology rewarded visible contentment more than internal truth. Contentment was performative. Jealousy threatened that performance because it showed cracks. A jealous glance, a bitter comment, a moment of withdrawal. These were signs that the internal discipline had failed. Failure was embarrassing. This embarrassment reinforced silence. People hid jealousy not because it was rare, but because it was humiliating. To envy was to admit you were unsatisfied with your place. Place mattered more than feeling. Medieval identity was anchored in position. Your role defined your worth. Jealousy questioned that definition. It suggested that roles could be unfair or insufficient. That suggestion was destabilizing. So jealousy was framed as distortion. It warped perception. It made small differences feel large. It exaggerated advantage. It minimized gratitude. Medieval writers often warned that envy made people blind to blessings. This framing shifted responsibility back onto the individual. If you felt jealous, it was because you failed to appreciate what you had. Gratitude was prescribed as treatment, not the warm, reflective gratitude of modern wellness culture, but enforced recognition of limits. You have enough. You should not want more. This did not eliminate desire. It suppressed it. Suppressed desire became resentment. Resentment was rarely named directly. It existed as sharpness. As bitterness. As coldness. As judgment. Medieval psychology recognized these traits but treated them as character flaws rather than emotional signals. A bitter person was unpleasant, not hurting. Unpleasantness justified exclusion. Jealous people often became isolated not because others knew what they felt, but because envy changed how they interacted. They withdrew. They criticized. They compared. Over time, this made relationships brittle. Isolation deepened envy. This feedback loop was not well understood, but it was observed. Medieval texts occasionally note that envy feeds on loneliness. Yet the proposed solution was rarely connection. Connection created comparison. Comparison created envy. The logic folded back on itself. So jealousy was managed through narrowing. Narrow your world. Narrow your focus. Narrow your desires. Avoid looking sideways. Look only upward, toward God or authority. Looking sideways invited trouble. This vertical orientation shaped emotional life. You were allowed to admire those above you. You were allowed to feel pity for those below. But comparison with equals was dangerous. Equals were rivals. Jealousy flourished among equals because difference felt unjustified. Why them and not me? Medieval psychology found this question particularly threatening. Hierarchy answered the question before it was asked. If someone above you had more, that was order. If someone beside you had more, that was imbalance. So jealousy among peers was treated harshly. Guilds, monasteries, and households enforced strict rules to minimize visible disparity. Not out of fairness, but to reduce envy. Uniformity was emotional management. Even clothing was regulated. Sumptuary laws limited who could wear what, not only to enforce class distinctions, but to prevent envy from becoming visible. If you could not display advantage, others would not resent it. This did not eliminate jealousy. It redirected it inward. Internalized envy became shame. You were ashamed for wanting what you were not meant to have. Shame reinforced obedience. Obedience stabilized society. Medieval psychology was less concerned with emotional well-being than with predictability. Jealousy was unpredictable. It motivated rebellion, betrayal, and unrest. So it was monitored. People watched each other closely for signs of envy. Compliments could be suspicious. Curiosity could be suspicious. Excessive interest in others' fortunes raised questions. Interest implied comparison. Comparison implied dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction implied envy. The safest emotional posture was indifference. But indifference was difficult to maintain. Humans noticed differences instinctively. Medieval psychology did not deny this. It simply demanded resistance. Resistance was moral labor. You were expected to work against your instincts. Jealousy was proof that the work was ongoing. Its presence did not shock anyone. Its expression did. Expression crossed a line. So jealousy lived mostly unspoken, shaping behavior subtly rather than dramatically. It influenced marriages, friendships, alliances, even devotion. Some theologians argued that envy could weaken faith. Seeing others rewarded while you struggled could create doubt. Doubt was dangerous. So jealousy was framed as a spiritual distraction. A temptation that pulled focus away from eternal matters. This framing offered meaning, but little relief. Meaning did not soothe the nervous system. It disciplined it. Medieval psychology excelled at discipline. And jealousy remained, quietly enduring, shaped by a system that believed endurance itself was virtue. Medieval psychology also linked jealousy to physical symptoms, reinforcing the idea that the body mirrored emotional imbalance. Heart palpitations, headaches, and fatigue were often interpreted as evidence of internal corruption. If you felt unwell after envy, it was not coincidence, it was proof that the humors were disturbed. The liver and spleen were frequently implicated, as they were considered central to processing emotions. Too much yellow bile could make you irritable, sharp-tongued, or vindictive. Too much black bile could deepen envy into resentment, making even minor slights feel catastrophic. Treatments ranged from diet adjustments, more cooling foods, less spice, to bloodletting, purging, and enforced labor. The goal was not comfort. The goal was alignment. Alignment was a moral and social imperative. An unbalanced person threatened more than themselves, they threatened the community. Medieval thought assumed a ripple effect. Jealousy in one individual could unsettle households, guilds, or even villages. Emotional containment was therefore a civic duty. Instruction in emotional control often started young. Children were observed for signs of envy, clinging to possessions, eyeing others' toys, expressing dissatisfaction. Early correction was valued. Gentle guidance might be given, but more often discipline was imposed. Physical correction, public shaming, and moral lectures were common tools. These were meant to teach moderation, obedience, and restraint, but they also seeded long-term internalized shame. Shame was a key instrument. It kept jealousy private. It taught people to monitor themselves constantly. The thought, the feeling, and the impulse were all scrutinized internally. Only external expression crossed a line clearly enough to be policed. Medieval psychology also intertwined jealousy with sin. It was not merely an emotional misstep, it was a spiritual hazard. Confess jealousy regularly to priests or confess to God through prayer. Do penance. Restrict desire. Avoid the objects of your envy. Sometimes, travel or pilgrimage was prescribed, not to soothe the heart, but to disrupt fixation, remove the mind from temptation. Distance was treatment. This spiritual framing had dual effects. It moralized the emotion and offered a path for management, albeit a rigorous and often uncomfortable one. Jealousy could be healed only through obedience, discipline, and spiritual submission. Satisfaction, relief, or understanding were secondary. Medieval psychology also treated envy as hereditary, not just in temperament but in fate. Some families were thought naturally prone to rivalry. Certain lineages were warned that envy was a recurring trial across generations. This deterministic thinking reduced the need to investigate external causes. It framed suffering as inevitable and intrinsic. If envy emerged, it was preordained, and the individual's task was merely containment. Interestingly, jealousy was sometimes acknowledged as a motivator, albeit a dangerous one. A jealous artisan might labor harder to achieve parity with a rival. A jealous scholar might study more diligently to match a peer. Yet even this benefit was ambivalent. Motivation derived from envy was unstable, morally suspect, and potentially destructive. The success it brought was secondary to the internal chaos it caused. Medieval psychology emphasized subtlety in all things. Outwardly, a person should appear calm, generous, and restrained. Inwardly, emotions churned. Jealousy was tolerated as long as it was invisible. Transparency was dangerous, discretion was necessary. A visible display of envy could mark one as morally weak, socially unreliable, or spiritually imperiled. In addition, medieval thinkers linked jealousy with insomnia and dreams. Sleepless nights were often explained as the mind replaying jealous scenarios, and dreams were interpreted as moral warnings. Dreaming of being outshone or overlooked was read as a signal from God or as evidence of humoral imbalance. Waking unrest was therefore a symptom, and nightly visions required interpretation and correction. Even literature reflected these attitudes. Tales and epics depicted envy as destructive, often leading to downfall or disaster. Characters consumed by jealousy suffered consequences, reinforcing the moral lesson. Readers were meant to internalize restraint. Life, like literature, was a lesson in moderation and endurance. This approach made medieval psychology systematic, but not empathetic. It provided a framework, a map, for understanding jealousy, but it did not seek to ease suffering. Knowledge equaled control, not comfort. Emotional literacy was about observation and containment, never catharsis. And yet, these lessons endured. Generations grew up learning that envy must be monitored, suppressed, and redirected. Social structures, rituals, and moral codes reinforced this vigilance. The individual became a self-policing agent of emotional order. By adulthood, jealousy was rarely a fleeting impulse. It had been internalized into posture, behavior, and even self-perception. People knew what to feel, how much to feel, and how to express it, or rather, how not to express it. Their inner lives were regimented, disciplined, and shaped to preserve stability. Ultimately, medieval psychology framed jealousy as a condition to survive, not a problem to solve. It was a constant, a companion, and a test of moral and social fortitude. To exist with envy was natural, to succumb to it openly was dangerous. Even today, echoes remain. The careful calibration of emotion, the shame of comparison, the moral framing of desire, these patterns have shaped cultural attitudes long after the humors were discarded. Medieval psychology did not eradicate jealousy. It taught humans to carry it, quietly, invisibly, as a measure of endurance, obedience, and self-control, and so, centuries of careful observation, moral framing, and disciplined suppression turned jealousy into a silent companion, a shadow of the social order, a lesson in containment that spanned lifetimes, families, and communities. Pride, in medieval psychology, was no simple vanity. It was a dangerous heat, an internal inflation of the spirit, measured by excess yellow bile or corrupted vital spirits. Pride was more threatening than envy because it could be visible, loud, and socially destabilizing. While jealousy was internalized, pride projected outward. It drew attention, challenged hierarchy, and invited moral correction. The symptoms of pride were many: outspoken behavior, refusal to accept correction, overestimation of abilities, excessive ornamentation in clothing, or seeking acknowledgement beyond one's station. Doctors, theologians, and moralists alike warned that pride could harden the heart, dry the mind, and disturb humoral balance. The treatment for pride was discipline, labor, and humiliation. Public correction, ritual confession, fasting, and physical labor were standard. Pride, unlike envy, required demonstration of subordination. You could feel jealousy quietly. Pride demanded correction in view of others to re-establish social and moral order. Yet pride also had paradoxical utility. Medieval thinkers acknowledged that controlled ambition and confidence could achieve excellence, inspire loyalty, or stabilize authority. The key, they insisted, was moderation. Pride that obeyed social and moral laws was acceptable. Pride that sought independence or disrupted hierarchy was dangerous. Fear was next, ever present, and more mechanical than emotional. Fear, they said, originated from poor blood flow, weak vital spirits, or cold, stagnant humors. The solution was stimulation, warmth, activity, and sometimes confrontation. Fear was never moral, it was physical. Courage was heat, cowardice was cold. The brave maintained body temperature, the fearful failed to circulate properly. This approach meant that medieval psychology treated fear pragmatically. You could not soothe it with reassurance alone. You had to adjust the body. Run, march, fight, eat warming foods, drink wine, or perform labor. Moral lectures were optional, circulation was essential. Fear was an error of the body, not the soul. Grief, however, was uniquely complex. It contained moral, spiritual, and humoral dimensions simultaneously. Grieving a death was a humoral imbalance, a spiritual trial, and a potential moral distraction. Overgriefing suggested excess black bile, dangerous introspection, and failure to accept divine order. Undergriefing implied callousness or sin. The balance was narrow, and the margin for error was perilously small. Dreams amplified this complexity. Dreams were morally charged, medically diagnostic, and spiritually revealing. A dream about losing teeth might be a warning of sin, a humoral imbalance, or impending misfortune. Falling indicated moral weakness. Flying could suggest divine favor or impending peril, depending on the context. Dreams were rarely neutral. Every unconscious thought was subject to scrutiny, interpretation, and potential correction. Love, the most dangerous of human experiences, was treated as illness. Love sickness was recognized, diagnosed, and aggressively treated. Symptoms included paleness, insomnia, loss of appetite, obsessive thinking, and poetic expression. The medieval solution was restraint, cold baths, bland diets, and sometimes marriage not as celebration, but containment. Passion was a fever, it had to be managed, drained, and supervised. Women were particularly scrutinized under these psychological systems. Their supposedly cold, wet, or damp humors made them prone to emotional excess. Education, intellectual activity, and emotional expression were all medically suspect. Protection was prescribed in the name of health. Restriction was justified morally, medically, and socially. Emotions were dangerous because they threatened internal balance and social order. Men, hotter and drier, were encouraged to maintain vigor, assertiveness, and rationality. Emotions were tolerated only when expressed in socially sanctioned ways. Rage could be managed by cooling diets and baths. Ambition could be tolerated if it reinforced hierarchy. Fear could be countered with activity and stimulation. Pride was a test, tempered by public correction. All psychological conditions were ultimately measured against social and moral order. The individual's internal state mattered less than its alignment with external expectations. Obedience, discipline, and containment were valued over understanding, empathy, or healing. Humor theory, bloodletting, purges, fasting, and labor were the instruments of psychological intervention. Spiritual practice, confession, prayer, and ritual complemented physical treatment. Mental life was regulated, observed, and corrected by multiple intersecting authorities, family, guilds, religious institutions, and medical practitioners. The cumulative effect was a society in which emotions were predictable, visible behavior was regulated, and internal suffering was both normal and invisible. People learned to navigate desire, envy, pride, fear, grief, and love as if walking a narrow ledge. Misstep could result in moral censure, social punishment, or physical correction. Success was endurance, not fulfillment. Internal reflection was monitored, external behavior disciplined, and deviation interpreted as failure of self or sin. Personal experience was subordinate to collective order, humoral balance, and moral law. Emotional turbulence was expected, observed, and contained, not explored or embraced. In short, medieval psychology created humans who endured. They carried envy silently, regulated passion rigorously, managed fear mechanically, and framed grief morally. The body and soul were both instruments of obedience, shaped by centuries of observation, theory, and social necessity. Even today, echoes of this system remain: the internalization of envy, the moral framing of ambition, the suspicion of unregulated desire, the emphasis on endurance over understanding. Medieval psychology did not disappear, it transformed into cultural norms that persist in subtle ways. Centuries after humors were discarded, obsession in medieval psychology was perhaps the most insidious. It was not merely focus or interest, it was a humoral disturbance, a spiritual hazard, and a moral test rolled into one. To fixate on an object, idea, or person was to allow internal imbalance to dominate. The mind could not be trusted to wander freely, wandering risked excess. Obsession was therefore both cause and symptom, proof of emotional excess and justification for intervention. Symptoms of obsession were clear to medieval observers: repeated thoughts, sleepless nights, constant distraction, and neglect of duties. Obsessive behaviors were seen as evidence that the humors were unsettled. Black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm were all implicated depending on the object of fixation. Treatment followed predictable patterns. Diet, bloodletting, fasting, physical labor, and enforced discipline were common. Removal of the obsessive object, whether a person, manuscript, or artifact, was often prescribed. Spiritual remedies, including prayer, confession, and pilgrimage, were recommended to redirect the mind toward moral alignment. Obsession was both disorder and moral failure. Melancholy was treated as the pinnacle of intellectual and emotional danger. It was a slow-burning affliction, most common among scholars, poets, and thinkers. Excess black bile caused brooding, introspection, and imaginative engagement, all considered dangerous. Reflection was itself risky. Prolonged thought could intensify melancholy, which in turn worsened the humoral imbalance. Treatment of melancholy was paradoxical. Scholars might be advised to avoid study, limit reading, reduce solitary reflection, and engage in physical labor. At the same time, they were expected to maintain piety and social responsibility. Moderation, the central principle of medieval psychology, was impossible to achieve perfectly, ensuring that the melancholic always lived in a state of precarious discipline. Hope, though less discussed, was carefully regulated. Too much hope was destabilizing, creating desire and potential disappointment. Too little hope was dangerous spiritually, potentially leading to despair, sin, or moral slackening. Hope had to be measured, channeled, and disciplined. Practices such as prayer, contemplation, and adherence to ritual acted as corrective forces. Emotional extremes were consistently moderated by both physical and spiritual means. Spiritual anxiety, what we might now call guilt or existential dread, was both pervasive and instructive. It arose from the recognition of moral imperfection, transgression, or failure to follow prescribed duties. Medieval psychology treated this anxiety as evidence of correct internal functioning. The mind recognized disorder and prompted corrective action. The response to anxiety was always external: confession, fasting, penance, ritual observance. Relief was temporary, monitoring was continuous. Dreams remained a cornerstone of psychological insight. Every vivid vision, nightmare, or unusual dream was interpreted as meaningful, morally charged, or humoral in origin. Dream interpretation manuals became indispensable. Dreams were maps, warnings, or divine communication. Correct interpretation required learned authority. Misinterpretation could be socially or spiritually dangerous. In addition to personal observation, social surveillance reinforced psychological norms. Families, guilds, and religious institutions monitored behaviors and emotions. Deviations in conduct, emotional expression, or ambition were noted, interpreted, and corrected. Public shaming, moral lectures, and corrective labor maintained collective discipline. Cumulative experience was critical. Each individual's emotional history was tracked implicitly through behavior, reputation, and response to treatment. The medieval psyche was not considered isolated, it was part of a continuum of social, moral, and humoral networks. The individual's endurance, obedience, and emotional regulation were essential not just for survival, but for the stability of the wider community. Even play, leisure, and celebration were regulated psychologically. Excessive laughter, boisterousness, or unrestrained joy could indicate humoral imbalance. Moderation was always the measure. Emotions were rarely expressed purely, they were performed within strict social and moral constraints. The goal of medieval psychology was therefore not happiness, understanding, or comfort. It was alignment, endurance, and containment. Humans were expected to navigate life with regulated emotions, disciplined thought, and controlled expression. Endurance itself was virtue. Emotional turbulence was natural, but its management was moral obligation. Modern readers might see cruelty or absurdity. Medieval practitioners saw order, clarity, and control. The systems were confident, consistent, and comprehensive, even if fundamentally incorrect. Humors, temperatures, moisture, and spiritual conditions combined into a framework that explained every emotion, behavior, and thought as measurable, observable, and correctable. By adulthood, the cumulative effect of these teachings produced humans finely tuned to survive within the structures of authority, hierarchy, and moral expectation. Emotions were disciplined, intellect was regulated, and desires were restrained. People learned to carry grief, envy, obsession, fear, pride, and hope with composure, never allowing their internal life to disrupt the fragile order imposed by social, spiritual, and humoral law. Even centuries later, echoes of this psychological framework remain. The internalization of envy, the framing of ambition as moral hazard, the suspicion of passion, and the value placed on endurance over comfort are all subtle legacies. Medieval psychology did not vanish, it shaped cultural norms, moral expectations, and emotional self-regulation long after its humors were discarded. Societal enforcement of emotion was central to medieval psychology. Humans were not simply individuals with private feelings, they were nodes in a network of observation, moral expectation, and social consequence. Every emotional display, every thought too openly expressed, had repercussions. A peasant who showed excessive grief might be accused of laziness or insubordination. A merchant who displayed anger in public could threaten the reputation and stability of his guild. Nobility who indulged in passion risked scandal or accusations of corruption. Emotions were regulated externally before they could be regulated internally. Children were trained from infancy to conform to these standards. Observing, correcting, and disciplining emotional expression was an educational priority. Tears, laughter, curiosity, fear, and desire were all subject to scrutiny. Excessive joy was suspicious, prolonged sadness was dangerous, bold questioning could be a symptom of humoral imbalance or spiritual weakness. The child learned quickly that emotional visibility invited correction, restraint, or punishment. By adulthood, emotional containment was instinctive. The morality of endurance was a cornerstone of this system. Pain, disappointment, grief, and longing were not obstacles, they were instruments of moral and social training. To suffer without complaint demonstrated strength, piety, and virtue. To express internal turmoil recklessly was not self-expression but moral failure. Endurance was valorized, resilience was rewarded socially and spiritually. Personal comfort was secondary, stability, obedience, and alignment with order were paramount. Life itself became a regimen of regulation. Diets, labor, religious observances, sleep patterns, and social conduct were all carefully prescribed to maintain humoral balance and emotional stability. Excess or deficiency in any domain was dangerous, potentially leading to sadness, obsession, anger, or even madness. Every behavior, thought, and feeling was interpreted through multiple overlapping lenses: humoral, spiritual, moral, and social. Dreams were not exceptions to these rules. Nightly visions were monitored, recorded, and interpreted. Monks, scholars, and medical practitioners acted as dream interpreters, decoding hidden moral lessons or diagnosing internal imbalance. A dream of falling could indicate moral weakness, a dream of flying might suggest divine favor or an excess of passion. Dreams reinforced surveillance of the mind, demonstrating that even unconscious life was under scrutiny. Cumulative life experience was measured by adherence to these norms. The medieval human was essentially a lifelong project of observation and correction. Success was not measured by happiness, achievement, or fulfillment, it was measured by conformity, endurance, and regulated emotion. Even intellectual activity was regulated. Reflection and study were allowed only in moderation, lest they generate excessive black bile, leading to melancholy or mental collapse. Obedience was both method and measure. Spiritual practice, labor, social conduct, and emotional regulation reinforced one another. Deviations were corrected swiftly, often painfully, to prevent disorder from spreading. Confession, penance, physical discipline, and enforced labor were all instruments for maintaining alignment between body, mind, and society. The medieval psyche was thus not private, autonomous, or autonomous in any modern sense. It was social, moral, and humoral, always observed, interpreted, and corrected. Individual suffering was natural, expected, and morally instructive. Relief was provisional and conditional. Emotions were not personal, they were communal responsibilities, morally and socially accountable. This framework extended even to interpersonal relationships. Marriage, friendship, mentorship, and social hierarchy were all sites of emotional regulation. Love was contained, jealousy suppressed, ambition guided, fear corrected, and pride disciplined. Emotional turbulence in others was monitored, corrected, or leveraged to maintain social order. The individual's internal life was inseparable from collective stability. Even small acts, laughter, display of skill, verbal disagreement, were morally and socially charged. Humor and play were tolerated only within controlled settings. Spontaneous joy could be interpreted as excess, imbalance, or moral lapse. The line between natural expression and dangerous transgression was narrow, shifting, and enforced constantly. In essence, medieval psychology created humans who were observant, self-regulating, disciplined, and morally accountable from cradle to grave. Emotions, desires, intellect, and dreams were all subject to moral and humoral oversight. Life was a continuous exercise in containment, endurance, and alignment. The ideal human was moderate, resilient, and obedient, emotionally visible only to those authorized to observe and correct. Even today, vestiges of this system remain. The internalization of envy, the moral framing of ambition, suspicion of passion, valuation of endurance over comfort, these are cultural echoes of medieval psychology. Though humors and spiritual interpretations have faded, the emphasis on regulated emotion, measured response, and social accountability persists in subtle ways. Medieval psychology, with its confidence, systematization, and moral rigor, did not aim to comfort, entertain, or heal. It aimed to produce stability, alignment, and endurance. Emotions were manageable substances, thoughts were physical processes, moral and social order were inseparable from psychological well-being. Survival, obedience, and containment were the metrics of success, not pleasure, insight, or self-understanding. And so, centuries of careful observation, moral framing, and disciplined regulation produced a society of humans who endured, contained, and regulated their inner lives. Pain was expected, suffering normalized, emotions disciplined, and the mind monitored, internally and externally, throughout life. Knowledge, confidence, and moral authority replaced empathy, accuracy, or scientific validation. Medieval psychology was confident, pervasive, and deeply influential, shaping not just individuals, but the cultural and moral landscapes in which they lived. Spiritual anxiety was one of the most pervasive and controlling aspects of medieval psychology. It was not merely worry or stress, it was moral, physical, and humoral all at once. Humans were expected to monitor their own conduct constantly, aware that sin, error, or moral laxity could disturb internal balance and provoke external consequence. Even minor lapses could be interpreted as signs of moral corruption or humoral imbalance. The sources of anxiety were many, unrepented thoughts, dreams, desires, or involuntary emotional responses. A fleeting jealous thought, a moment of pride, or a pang of unregulated desire could trigger fear of divine punishment or physical deterioration. The mind and body were intertwined. Moral transgression produced humoral disturbance, which produced physical and emotional symptoms. Anxiety, therefore, was both cause and symptom, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Ritualized behavior was a central mechanism for managing this anxiety. Prayer, fasting, confession, pilgrimage, and repetitive labor acted as psychological stabilizers. These rituals disciplined the mind, regulated emotion, and reinforced moral alignment. The repetition of ritualized acts provided a sense of predictability in a world otherwise chaotic and dangerous. Emotional containment was reinforced by physical action. Kneeling, bowing, walking, or enduring hardship became tools of mental regulation. Social observation amplified this regulation. The medieval human was never fully private. Family, guilds, neighbors, clergy, and supervisors all acted as psychological monitors. Deviant behavior, emotional excess, or intellectual ambition was interpreted, corrected, and sometimes punished. Surveillance was both moral and medical. Failure to conform indicated internal imbalance as much as moral failing. Humans learned to modulate emotion and behavior preemptively, internalizing external pressures as part of their own psychological framework. Cumulative life experience was interpreted through these overlapping lenses. From childhood to adulthood, from novice to elder, humans were measured by their ability to endure, regulate, and conform. Happiness was never the goal. Survival, social alignment, and moral integrity were the metrics of success. Emotional turbulence was natural, but it was always constrained, channeled, and corrected. Those who could maintain balance in the face of grief, fear, obsession, love, or ambition were considered psychologically healthy, morally upright, and socially reliable. Education and intellectual engagement were tightly controlled. Too much thought was dangerous, too little left one ignorant. Reading, reflection, and study were permitted only in moderation. Excessive intellectual exertion was thought to overheat the brain, dry out vital humors, and invite melancholy or madness. Life under medieval psychology was a continuous exercise in discipline, endurance, and moral regulation. Humans learned to carry envy silently, suppress obsession, regulate fear, contain grief, moderate desire, and measure ambition. Their emotional, intellectual, and physical lives were intertwined in a single system of surveillance, correction, and endurance. Happiness, comfort, or self-expression was secondary to alignment with moral, social, and humoral expectations. Even centuries later, echoes of these frameworks persist. Cultural norms, moral expectations, emotional self-regulation, and social accountability all carry traces of medieval psychology. Endurance remains valorized, emotional restraint is socially praised, ambition and passion are morally framed and socially evaluated. Humans still internalize observation, interpret emotions morally, and regulate thought and behavior to align with expectations established centuries ago. Medieval psychology, confident, pervasive, and morally authoritative, did not aim to comfort, entertain, or validate experience. It aimed to produce humans capable of enduring, containing, and aligning themselves to a system of moral, social, and humoral order. Endurance, regulation, and obedience were measures of success. Emotions were substances to be monitored, thoughts processes to be tempered, and moral and social alignment the ultimate goal. The medieval mind was trained for survival, social, moral, and physical. Emotional turbulence was natural but contained. Intellectual engagement was permitted but moderated. Dreams, desires, and obsessions were monitored, interpreted, and corrected. Even sleep and leisure were instruments of alignment. Survival, obedience, and regulated emotion were the metrics of a successful life. In sum, medieval psychology did not understand the mind as we do. It understood humans as systems to be measured, corrected, and aligned. Humors, moral law, ritual, labor, and social expectation combined to produce individuals capable of enduring life's hardships with measured, regulated emotion. Confidence, not accuracy, guided the entire system, ensuring that humans, while often suffering, remained aligned with social and moral order. Moral hierarchy under medieval psychology was as important as humors themselves. Every person had a preordained place within society, and emotional regulation was interpreted through that lens. Nobles, scholars, clergy, and peasants were judged differently for the same behavior. A noble's melancholy might be poetic or indicative of wisdom, a scholar's obsession could signify intellect, a peasant's anger, however, was dangerous, destabilizing, and morally suspect. Emotional expression was never equal, its acceptability was determined by rank, role, and perception of spiritual and humoral balance. Spiritual and social reinforcement maintained this hierarchy. Prayer, confession, ritual observance, labor, and social scrutiny were instruments of psychological alignment. A single person's emotions were never isolated, they were interpreted by the community, sanctioned by religious authority, and corrected through prescribed methods. Compliance and endurance reinforced status, deviation could threaten both physical health and social standing. Humans were thus trained from birth to internalize external authority, to self-monitor, and to regulate thought, emotion, and behavior according to socially sanctioned norms. The cumulative human condition, from childhood to old age, was therefore an exercise in vigilance and endurance. Physical, emotional, and intellectual life were inseparable. Fear, grief, desire, curiosity, joy, love, obsession, and anger were all potential sources of imbalance. Even subtle deviations could attract correction, a sigh, a glance, or a hesitant question could mark a person as needing moral, spiritual, or humoral adjustment. Life was a continuous negotiation between internal states and external expectations. Compliance, endurance, and regulation became moral virtues. Suffering, physical or emotional, was expected and often valorized. Happiness was temporary, stability was permanent. The human mind, the body, and social standing were a single system, each component influencing the others. To navigate life successfully was to endure, regulate, and align, constantly aware that deviation was visible and interpretable. Modern psychology, with its emphasis on empathy, understanding, and internal exploration, might view this framework as harsh, cruel, or absurd. Medieval psychology would have regarded modern self-expression as dangerous, indulgent, and destabilizing. Confidence replaced accuracy, moral clarity replaced insight, and endurance replaced comfort. Even when medieval theorists were wrong about humors, fluids, or organs, the system worked in its own terms. It produced compliant, regulated, socially integrated humans capable of surviving harsh, unpredictable conditions. Even death, the ultimate test of mind and body, was subject to psychological interpretation. Mental distress, despair, or fear of death was not merely human experience, it was a reflection of moral and humoral imbalance. Preparation for death, including confession, penance, prayer, and regulated emotion, was as much psychological as spiritual. The dying were trained, instructed, and corrected until their final breaths, ensuring alignment with societal and moral order. Legacy is perhaps the most profound aspect. While the humoral theories and moral frameworks of medieval psychology have faded, their echoes remain in cultural attitudes toward emotion, endurance, ambition, and moral responsibility. Emotional containment is praised, overindulgence is suspect, resilience is valorized. Subtle hierarchies of acceptability, surveillance, and judgment persist in modern education, workplace culture, and social expectation. The medieval mind, disciplined, observed, and morally accountable, still informs contemporary notions of behavior, responsibility, and self-regulation. The overarching principle is simple: life is navigated through regulation. Thought, emotion, and desire are subject to moral and social interpretation. The body is monitored for signs of excess or deficiency. Dreams, sleep, leisure, study, love, grief, and anger are all observed, interpreted, and corrected. Endurance, moderation, and alignment are the ultimate measures of psychological health, social value, and moral integrity. Medieval psychology, for all its errors and limitations, was systematic, confident, and comprehensive. It did not aim to comfort, entertain, or validate. It aimed to produce humans capable of surviving life's hardships, morally aligned, socially integrated, and emotionally contained. Pain, suffering, restriction, and observation were not side effects, they were central to the process. Through this framework, humans became self-regulating, morally accountable, and psychologically resilient, even in a world filled with danger, disease, and disorder, and so, the medieval human was trained to endure, to experience sorrow without complaint, to moderate thought, to contain passion, to regulate fear, to manage obsession, and to navigate life under constant scrutiny. Every action, thought, and emotion was both personal and communal, morally and physically accountable, humoral and spiritual. The mind and body were inseparable, observed and corrected continuously. Even as modern understanding of psychology, medicine, and emotion has evolved, the echoes of medieval practice remain. Valuing endurance over comfort, moralizing emotional expression, regulating ambition and desire, and internalizing external surveillance are all subtle cultural legacies. Confidence, ritual, observation, and moral authority continue to shape human behavior, long after the humors have been abandoned. Daily life in medieval society was a constant exercise in social, moral, and psychological enforcement. Every routine, from waking to sleeping, was structured to maintain alignment between body, mind, and society. Labor was not merely productive, it was corrective. Farming, weaving, building, or clerical work disciplined the body, regulated emotion, and reinforced social order. Idleness was morally suspect, distraction was dangerous, overindulgence was punished by humoral imbalance or social censure. Education reinforced these principles. Children were taught not just skills or knowledge, but how to contain emotion, regulate thought, and conform to social expectation. Observation and correction were integral. A child who cried excessively, questioned too boldly, or displayed excessive curiosity risked admonishment, discipline, or spiritual instruction. Knowledge was a privilege, but only when exercised with moderation. Excessive ambition or intellectual fervor was a moral and medical hazard. Religious observance was both a psychological stabilizer and a mechanism of control. Prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and confession disciplined the mind and body, regulated emotional expression, and reinforced moral authority. Daily rituals and observances created predictability, teaching individuals to internalize authority, monitor their own conduct, and maintain alignment with humoral, spiritual, and social expectations. Religious instruction intertwined with psychological enforcement. Sin was illness, transgression caused imbalance, and correction restored harmony. Social interactions functioned as constant psychological calibration. Public behavior, gestures, tone of voice, and expression of thought were all scrutinized. Gossip, observation, and commentary acted as both enforcement and surveillance. Deviations from accepted norms, anger, passion, grief, or excessive curiosity, were interpreted as moral and humoral imbalances, prompting intervention. Authority figures, peers, and family collectively maintained this system, ensuring that emotional and intellectual life remained regulated. The rhythm of labor, ritual, and leisure was precisely orchestrated. Work disciplined the body, prayer regulated the mind, communal activities aligned emotion with social expectation. Even leisure and play were carefully contained, festivals, music, and games occurred within controlled settings and time frames. Excessive indulgence or spontaneous joy was suspect, potentially disruptive, and morally suspect. Life's pace, measured and regulated, reinforced endurance, containment, and moral accountability. Institutions, churches, guilds, courts, and schools, acted as extensions of medieval psychology. Each enforced moral, emotional, and intellectual regulation, often codifying behavior into rules, procedures, and punishments. Mistakes were interpreted as moral failings or humoral imbalance, correction was applied physically, spiritually, or socially. The individual was never separate from these institutions. Identity, conduct, and emotional life were shaped continuously by their oversight. Cultural norms internalized this constant regulation. Humans learned to self-monitor, correct impulses, and anticipate social judgment. Even private emotion and thought were influenced by communal expectations. Desire, ambition, grief, joy, and curiosity were all filtered through moral, humoral, and social lenses. Emotional containment became instinctive, compliance, endurance, and moderation were internalized as measures of success. Love, ambition, creativity, and passion were tolerated only within limits. Excess led to moral censure, humoral imbalance, or medical intervention. Romantic love was regulated, intellectual ambition was measured, and creative expression was contained. The ideal individual navigated life with awareness of these boundaries, balancing personal experience with external expectation, and enduring discomfort as necessary. Death and mortality were central psychological concerns. Anxiety over death, fear of judgment, and anticipation of punishment were not abstract, they were physical, emotional, and moral realities. Preparation for death involved discipline, correction, and adherence to ritual. Confession, fasting, prayer, and emotional regulation were applied until the final moments, ensuring alignment with moral and social order even at life's end. The cumulative effect of medieval psychology produced humans who were resilient, regulated, and socially integrated, capable of enduring extreme adversity. Emotional turbulence was natural but contained, intellectual activity was permitted but moderated, dreams, desire, and obsession were monitored, interpreted, and corrected. Confidence, ritual, observation, and moral authority guided behavior, producing alignment between mind, body, and society. Even today, remnants of medieval psychological frameworks persist. Cultural emphasis on emotional restraint, endurance, moral responsibility, and social accountability echoes centuries of practice. Humans internalize observation, anticipate judgment, and regulate thought and emotion according to norms established long ago. Confidence, not accuracy, remains a powerful cultural force, shaping perception and behavior across generations. In conclusion, medieval psychology was a system of profound confidence, moral authority, and social integration. Emotions were substances to be monitored, thought was a potential hazard, dreams were evidence, the body was a measure of moral and humoral balance. Life was a continuous exercise in endurance, containment, and alignment. Pain, suffering, correction, and regulation were not side effects, they were central to producing a resilient, morally aligned, and socially integrated human. Medieval gender psychology was a cornerstone of the system, shaping expectations, behavior, and regulation for men and women differently. Men were described as hot and dry, rational, and naturally aligned with leadership, courage, and public authority. Their emotions, if contained, were acceptable, even admirable. Anger could be tolerated as a sign of internal heat, ambition was a marker of vitality. Yet even for men, excess passion, unmoderated ambition, or obsessive thought could provoke humoral imbalance, melancholy, or madness. Regulation remained essential. Women, on the other hand, were described as cold and wet, psychologically unstable, and morally and emotionally susceptible. Their brains, bodies, and minds were considered delicate, prone to excess, and easily disrupted by intellectual exertion or emotional engagement. Education, intellectual curiosity, and emotional expression were treated not just as socially unnecessary but as medically risky. Women were encouraged, or forced, to internalize discipline, moderation, and obedience. Emotions were to be contained, thought was to be measured, physical and emotional health depended on submission to social and moral hierarchy. Childhood was the formative arena for these principles. Boys were gradually trained to manage internal heat, channel energy into labor or study, and moderate emotional expression. Punishment and reward were inseparable from this framework. Compliance, moderation, endurance, and alignment were rewarded through social recognition, moral approval, and spiritual reinforcement. Deviation, excess, or imbalance invited correction, moral instruction, labor, fasting, ritual, or medical intervention. Even private experience was monitored, interpreted, and corrected when necessary. Humans learned early that survival, social integration, and moral approval depended on continuous self-regulation. Cultural and psychological legacy persisted across generations. Emotional containment, moral accountability, endurance, and regulation remained prized virtues. Social hierarchies and gender norms internalized psychological expectations. Knowledge, creativity, and ambition were celebrated cautiously, valued only when balanced with moderation. Even in contemporary times, echoes of these systems influence attitudes toward emotion, intellect, gender, and morality. Ultimately, medieval psychology was less about comfort or insight and more about order, endurance, and confidence. The system was complete: emotions as substances, thought as a hazard, desire as disease, dreams as evidence, and the body as a moral and social instrument. Regulation, containment, and correction were both method and measure. The ideal human endured, complied, and aligned with the expectations of humors, society, and divine authority. Pain, suffering, and restriction were not incidental, they were integral. Discipline was moral, spiritual, and medical. Life was structured around correction, endurance, and alignment, producing humans capable of surviving extreme hardship while adhering to social, moral, and humoral norms. Confidence, ritual, and observation replaced understanding, insight, or personal experience. Accuracy was irrelevant, authority was decisive. Medieval psychology, with its thoroughness, confidence, and integration of mind, body, and society, produced a system in which humans internalized regulation, anticipated judgment, and practiced containment continuously. Endurance became a measure of moral and social value. Emotional turbulence was natural but dangerous. Intellectual engagement was permitted only within bounds. Dreams, desire, and thought were monitored, interpreted, and corrected. Humans became agents of their own regulation, surviving not by comfort but by alignment with the system. Even centuries later, the echoes remain. Cultural norms, social expectations, and moral imperatives continue to shape behavior, emotion, and thought. Endurance is praised, overindulgence is suspicious, ambition is morally evaluated, emotional expression is measured. The medieval system of confidence, correction, and regulation persists, subtly informing modern psychology, education, and social life. The final reflection of medieval psychology lies in its integration of morality, social hierarchy, and emotional regulation. Every individual was simultaneously a moral, psychological, and physical subject. Behavior, emotion, and thought were inseparable from social expectation. The system operated as a feedback loop. Internal states were observed, interpreted, corrected, and reintegrated, producing individuals who internalized authority, regulated themselves, and aligned with the humoral, spiritual, and social order. Gendered expectations were central to this system. Men were guided to regulate heat, ambition, and courage, aligning with public and moral authority. Women were trained to contain curiosity, moderate emotion, and internalize obedience, balancing fragility with moral and social duty. Children of both sexes were subjected to early instruction, ritual, labor, and observation, producing adults capable of navigating a world in which social, moral, and humoral order was inseparable from survival. Social surveillance and communal enforcement ensured compliance. Behavior, expression, and thought were continuously monitored by peers, family, religious authorities, and medical practitioners. Emotional excess, intellectual ambition, or moral deviation was immediately visible and subject to correction. Humans learned to anticipate judgment, self-regulate, and maintain outward conformity. Internal states were never private, they were interpretable, accountable, and subject to intervention. Emotional containment was both a survival mechanism and a moral imperative. Sadness was bile, anger was heat, fear was cold blood, love was fever, and desire was a dangerous imbalance. Dreams were evidence, intellectual curiosity a potential hazard, and ambition a medical risk. Regulation, discipline, and moderation were constant. Individuals were taught to endure discomfort, suppress excess, and navigate life with vigilance, ensuring alignment with the humoral, moral, and social order. The role of punishment and reward reinforced these principles. Compliance, moderation, and endurance were socially recognized, morally approved, and spiritually sanctioned. Deviation, excess, or imbalance prompted correction through labor, ritual, fasting, prayer, medical intervention, or social censure. Even private thoughts were morally accountable. Survival and social integration depended on continuous self-regulation. Work, prayer, education, and leisure were all structured to maintain alignment between mind, body, and society. Labor disciplined the body, ritual regulated the mind, and communal observation ensured emotional containment. Play, creativity, and leisure occurred only within controlled contexts. Excess, indulgence, or spontaneity were suspect, potentially destabilizing, and morally questionable. Life was a continuous negotiation between internal states and external expectation. Even mortality was psychologically structured. Death was a test of endurance, moral alignment, and humoral balance. Fear of death, despair, and grief were interpreted as moral and physical imbalances. Preparation involved confession, fasting, prayer, and emotional regulation. Individuals were corrected and disciplined until their final moments, ensuring that alignment with moral, social, and humoral order persisted to the end. The legacy of medieval psychology is enduring. Cultural emphasis on endurance, emotional containment, moral responsibility, and internalized authority continues to shape behavior and thought. Hierarchies of acceptability, surveillance, and judgment persist in education, work, and social norms. Emotional restraint is praised, overindulgence is viewed with suspicion, ambition and curiosity are measured carefully. Confidence, ritual, observation, and moral authority remain powerful cultural forces. Modern psychology, education, and social life carry subtle echoes of these principles. Humans continue to internalize social expectations, monitor their own behavior, regulate emotion, and anticipate judgment. Endurance remains valorized, moderation is praised, conformity is rewarded. Even when understanding of the mind and body has evolved, the cultural residue of medieval psychology persists, shaping contemporary norms of behavior, emotion, and morality. Ultimately, medieval psychology was a system of confidence, observation, and regulation. Emotions were substances to be monitored, thought was a hazard, desire was dangerous, and the body was a moral instrument. Life was navigated through endurance, moderation, and alignment. Pain, restriction, and correction were central, not incidental. Humans learned to internalize authority, regulate themselves, and survive in a world where comfort was secondary to moral, social, and humoral order. Even today, the echoes endure. Emotional containment, moral accountability, endurance, and vigilance continue to inform human behavior. Ambition, curiosity, and expression are tempered by social expectation. Dreams, desire, and intellectual activity remain culturally monitored. Confidence, ritual, and authority shape understanding more than insight or experience. The system of medieval psychology, though centuries old, continues to resonate, influencing the ways humans think, feel, and behave in subtle, persistent ways. Medieval psychology, in all its complexity, confidence, and integration of mind, body, and society, produced humans capable of surviving extreme adversity while adhering to moral, social, and humoral expectations. Pain, suffering, and restriction were not incidental, they were tools of regulation. Life was navigated with endurance, self-monitoring, and alignment. Confidence replaced accuracy, moral authority replaced empathy, observation replaced understanding. The medieval human was disciplined, regulated, and resilient, an enduring product of a system that valued control, order, and survival above all else. Even as centuries passed, medieval psychology shaped cultural assumptions about emotion, intellect, and morality. Emotional restraint was valorized, endurance celebrated, and suffering framed as moral opportunity. Anger was still associated with heat, melancholy with imbalance, and passion with fever. Humans internalized these lessons, learning to anticipate judgment, suppress excess, and monitor thought and feeling continuously. Personal experience was rarely neutral. Every sensation, emotion, and idea was interpreted through the lens of moral, humoral, and social expectations. Humoral theory remained the backbone of this psychological framework. Life was a constant balancing act among blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, misfortune, or emotional turmoil were rarely seen as random. They were evidence of imbalance, moral lapse, or physical weakness. Treatment, whether through diet, purging, bloodletting, or ritual, was designed to restore equilibrium. Success was measured not by comfort or insight but by survival, compliance, and the appearance of balance. Failure was rarely attributed to systemic error. It was seen as evidence of personal deficiency or spiritual weakness. Education, discipline, and social expectation functioned as extensions of medieval psychology. Children learned early to self-monitor, internalize authority, and maintain moderation. Intellectual curiosity was permitted only under supervision. Excessive thought risked mental collapse. Play and leisure were structured to reinforce order, social norms, and humoral stability. Even private reflection was potentially dangerous, requiring moderation, observation, and, at times, physical intervention. Religious and social institutions reinforced psychological principles. Ritual, prayer, confession, and communal activities acted as mechanisms of correction and moral alignment. Deviance was detected and corrected through social, spiritual, and sometimes medical intervention. The individual became a site of continuous observation, discipline, and regulation, learning that survival, social integration, and moral approval depended on adherence to the system. Dreams, imagination, and desire were scrutinized and interpreted. Nighttime visions were not neutral, they were messages demanding moral or physical correction. Erotic dreams, vivid imagination, and creative thought could provoke intervention, treatment, or censure. The human mind was not autonomous, it was a field of observation, moral evaluation, and regulation. Emotional containment was a survival skill, intellectual moderation a necessity, and endurance a virtue. Love and desire, framed as illness or imbalance, were regulated rigorously. Romantic obsession was treated as fever, attraction as danger. Individuals were instructed to moderate emotion, redirect attention, and endure discomfort. Marriage, work, and ritual were employed as corrective mechanisms. Passion was tolerated only in controlled doses. Expression outside of sanctioned contexts was dangerous, morally suspect, and medically concerning. Fear and courage were physically and morally regulated. Cold, slow, or retreating blood produced cowardice, warm, circulating blood produced bravery. Training, stimulation, diet, and moral instruction were used to manage internal states. Emotional expression was never simply reaction, it was carefully contained, moderated, and socially observed. Moral accountability and humoral balance were inseparable from psychological regulation. The legacy of medieval psychology is subtle but persistent. Contemporary norms of endurance, self-regulation, emotional restraint, and anticipation of social judgment trace back to these medieval systems. Even as science and understanding evolved, cultural residues remained. Humans continue to internalize expectation, monitor thought and behavior, and regulate emotion according to norms that originated centuries ago. Confidence, authority, and ritual remain more persuasive than insight or empathy in shaping behavior. Ultimately, medieval psychology was a system designed for survival, social conformity, and moral alignment. Emotions were substances, thought was hazardous, desire was dangerous, and the body was a moral instrument. Life was navigated through endurance, self-regulation, and alignment with authority. Suffering, discomfort, and restriction were central, producing humans capable of surviving extreme adversity while maintaining alignment with moral, social, and humoral expectations. Even now, the echoes remain. Cultural emphasis on moderation, endurance, and emotional regulation continues to shape education, work, and social life. Humans are still conditioned to anticipate judgment, suppress excess, and internalize authority. Dreams, desire, and ambition are measured, observed, and often moderated. The principles of medieval psychology, though centuries old, continue to resonate in subtle, persistent ways, proof that confidence, ritual, and authority can endure far longer than accuracy, empathy, or understanding. All of these threads, emotion, humors, gender, morality, social expectation, and psychological regulation, intertwined to form a medieval worldview in which humans were subjects of observation, correction, and endurance. Life itself became a test of moderation, compliance, and alignment with systems that were confident, structured, and comprehensive, if not accurate. Every thought, feeling, dream, and desire was interpreted, categorized, and addressed, sometimes through moral instruction, sometimes through physical intervention, and always through the lens of order and authority. Sadness was not merely a mood, it was black bile to be drained, expelled, or balanced. Anger was not merely frustration, it was excess heat to be cooled through diet, bloodletting, or abstinence. Fear was not simply caution, it was sluggish blood to be warmed, stimulated, and brought into circulation. Desire, creativity, and intellectual curiosity were not optional luxuries, they were potential threats to humoral equilibrium, morality, and social harmony. Love was feverish, passion a risk, imagination a medical concern. Every emotional or intellectual state demanded regulation, containment, or correction. Gender was inseparable from this system. Men's bodies, minds, and emotions were hot, dry, and naturally authoritative. Women's bodies, minds, and emotions were cold, wet, and naturally vulnerable. These distinctions justified differential treatment, education, and surveillance. Girls were taught obedience, moderation, and emotional restraint, boys were taught courage, endurance, and self-discipline. Adults were continuously monitored, children were trained to anticipate authority. Society functioned through expectation, compliance, and internalized regulation. Dreams and imagination were equally significant. Nighttime visions were never neutral, they were messages to be decoded, interpreted, and corrected. Pleasant dreams might indicate moral laxity, nightmares could indicate sin, temptation, or humoral imbalance. Erotic dreams, vivid imagination, or creative thought were treated as evidence of moral or physical excess, sometimes prompting intervention, fasting, prayer, or bloodletting. Humans were responsible for their unconscious experience, accountable even while asleep. Social and moral hierarchy reinforced psychological expectations. Peasants, nobles, and scholars were subject to differing tolerances and interpretations. Melancholy among a learned monk might be tolerated, but among a peasant it was dangerous. Erratic behavior among the nobility might be eccentricity, but the same among the poor was evidence of moral or humoral failure. Psychology, morality, and social class were inseparable, ensuring that observation, regulation, and correction were continuous across society. Even survival was structured psychologically. Pain, discomfort, and restriction were not incidental, they were central to the system. Humans learned endurance, moderation, and alignment with authority as necessary skills. Suffering was a teacher, compliance, a reward. Moral, social, and physical expectations were integrated into daily life, guiding labor, education, prayer, recreation, and even sleep. Humans became self-regulating agents, constantly monitoring thought, emotion, and behavior against internalized norms. The legacy of medieval psychology is profound. Endurance, self-regulation, and emotional moderation remain culturally valued. Ambition, curiosity, and desire continue to be socially evaluated. Dreams, thought, and behavior are still interpreted, if more subtly, through moral, social, and psychological lenses. The principles of confidence, ritual, authority, and observation persist in shaping human life, long after the humors and bloodletting have disappeared. Ultimately, medieval psychology was a system of confidence, certainty, and pervasive authority. Humans were moral, psychological, and physical subjects, observed, corrected, and aligned with humoral, spiritual, and social expectations. Emotions were substances, thoughts were hazards, desire was dangerous, and the body was a moral instrument. Survival depended on endurance, self-regulation, and compliance. Pain, suffering, and restriction were central, producing humans capable of navigating extreme adversity while maintaining alignment with order, authority, and expectation. Even today, echoes of this system remain. Emotional restraint is praised, endurance is valorized, curiosity is monitored, ambition is measured. Dreams, desire, and intellectual engagement are evaluated through subtle moral and social frameworks. Confidence, ritual, and authority continue to shape human behavior more than insight, empathy, or understanding ever could. Medieval psychology, in all its meticulous integration of mind, body, and society, created humans capable of survival, discipline, and compliance in the face of adversity. Life was navigated through regulation, observation, and endurance. Pain and restriction were not flaws but tools. Thought and emotion were to be monitored and contained. Authority, ritual, and moral expectation structured daily existence. And through it all, humans internalized these lessons, producing a cultural legacy that persists subtly but powerfully, centuries later. This is the full arc of medieval psychology, a system confident in its logic, rigorous in its observation, and relentless in its enforcement. It framed sadness, anger, fear, love, and desire as subjects of moral, physical, and humoral regulation. It enforced gendered expectations, monitored children and adults, interpreted dreams, and treated the mind as a site of constant moral accountability. It produced humans who endured, complied, and internalized authority, leaving a psychological and cultural legacy that echoes into the modern era. The lessons are clear: regulation, endurance, and internalized observation were the keys to surviving in a world of uncertainty, moral expectation, and physical danger. Confidence replaced understanding. Authority replaced insight. Pain replaced comfort. And yet, in producing humans capable of navigating this system, medieval psychology left a legacy that persists far beyond its era, shaping the ways humans think, feel, and behave even today. Even as medieval products evolved, their failures and frustrations mirrored the logic of medieval psychology. Toothpaste, soap, mattresses, candles, pillows, buttons, and eyeglasses were not designed for comfort, pleasure, or convenience. They were tools of survival, endurance, and social expectation. They demanded patience, moderation, and perseverance, much like the human mind under the watchful eye of humoral theory and moral authority. Just as emotions were substances to be balanced, the objects humans used daily were instruments to navigate a difficult, unyielding world. Take toothpaste, abrasive powders that remove plaque at the cost of enamel, dignity, and joy. Painful, frustrating, minimally effective, yet humans persisted, refining, adjusting, and enduring. Life demanded it. Soap burned, stripped the skin, and sometimes caused rashes, yet the social cost of foul odor was higher than temporary suffering. Candles dripped, smoked, and threatened fire, yet they brought light, controlled chaos, and the ability to function after dark. Mattresses were lumpy, straw-stuffed traps that encouraged wakefulness and back pain, teaching resilience and the acceptance of imperfection. Eyeglasses pinched, slid, and barely corrected vision, yet they permitted literacy and knowledge, essential for navigating social, religious, and economic hierarchies. All of these products imposed discipline and endurance, just as medieval psychology demanded regulation of mind and emotion. Suffering was normalized. Discomfort was expected. Frustration, whether physical or emotional, was a necessary companion to survival. The human body and mind were continuously observed, tested, and corrected, through products, routines, and medical authority. Pain and inconvenience were tools, shaping resilience, compliance, and vigilance. Even love and desire were instruments of endurance. Love sickness was treated as illness, passion as fever, and romantic obsession as danger to humoral balance. Individuals were instructed to moderate their emotions, redirect attention, and endure discomfort, just as they endured the prick of a button, the sting of soap, or the scratch of straw in a mattress. Emotion and object, mind and body, were inseparable fields of observation, regulation, and correction. Gendered expectations intertwined with both psychology and material life. Men were hot, dry, and authoritative, expected to endure pain, regulate anger, and maintain courage, even when confronted with failing products, physical discomfort, or moral hazard. Women were cold, wet, and morally vulnerable, expected to endure emotional strain, avoid intellectual overexertion, and maintain obedience while navigating equally challenging material and social conditions. Comfort, ease, or personal indulgence were secondary to compliance with humoral, moral, and societal order.